All right, Sally, I think we can go ahead and get started here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. We're so glad that you were able to join us tonight. I'm Sally Bradshaw from Midtown Reader, an independent bookstore here in Tallahassee in Midtown, Thomasville Road, and we're really excited to partner with WFSU tonight for the special book club in conjunction with WFSU. On April 9th, as I think you're aware, WFSU will air the documentary Oliver Sachs, His Own Life. And in anticipation of that, tonight we put together a fantastic panel, a wonderful program to discuss Sachs's work, An Anthropologist on Mars, which was published in 1996. We have a host of people to introduce, but I would be remiss if I did not thank Kim Kelling, who's the Director of Content and Programming and Community Partnerships for WFSU. She has worked closely with us on many programs, and we're grateful for her work on bringing the Oliver Sacks documentary to us in Tallahassee and for partnering with us on this book club presentation. Really, really appreciative of this. Before we get started, I'm going to let Jeremy Eason, our events director, show you a brief announcement from Midtown Reader. Then we'll introduce the panel and we'll get going.
You know what she said next. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home.
Thank you for that moment, that special moment. We are proud to partner with WFSU in so many ways, and I feel it's important to remind you that WFSU is our community public station, radio, television. WFSQ provides great classical music to us. It has been so important to me to be connected to the community during the time of the pandemic through WFSU and their terrific programming and content. They're running a pledge drive right now. They need our help, and so I am proud to ask for your support for WFSU. I know that many of you are already supporting WFSU, but they are in the midst of a pledge drive, their spring drive. So if you're interested, go to WFSU.org to learn more and to pledge your support. And with that, let me go to the wonderful Tom Flanigan, who's our moderator and host for this evening, and he will moderate the panel and take questions from you. And the way this is going to work is that he'll introduce the other panelists, and then he will take questions. So you'll have an opportunity to submit those, I think, through chat. Jeremy, is that right? And
yeah, the Q&A button right at the bottom there of the screen. That's where you're going to just put any questions you have in throughout the conversation. If something piques your interest, go ahead and stick it in there and we'll get to you, okay?
We'll do our best to get to you. That's great. So I call Tom Flanigan the Steve Inskeep of WFSU, but when in talking to him today, I decided Steve Inskeep was really the Tom Flanigan. I am so delighted that Tom Flanigan has been a part of FSU News since 2006. He has, as you know, the program Perspectives. He has a focus on covering local news personalities, issues, organizations, the state capitol, but he began his broadcast career more than 30 years ago. And he covered news for several radio stations, not only in Florida, but in Texas, and if you did not know it, his home state of Maryland. He spent a number of years in corporate communications for some private firms and felt this time was invaluable to give him an expanded media perspective. We are the beneficiary of that expanded perspective. And during the rare times when he's not racing to cover community events and activities, Tom not only enjoys reading, he's a Midtown Reader, but he plays the guitar. So I am convinced we need to do something soon where Tom can showcase his musical talents. He is joined tonight by Dr. Michael Bakken, who he will introduce, and also Dr. Amy Weatherby. We're thrilled to have you all. Thank you so much for joining us for this terrific read that WFSU provided to all of us free of charge. And with that, Tom, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Sally Bradshaw, and thank everyone at Midtown Reader for being a part of this collaborative effort, this virtual book club that we are convening tonight. And thank all of you guys for joining us too. This is exciting. So many reasons really to join together tonight, but our prime motivator, as Sally said, of course, is the upcoming broadcast of Oliver Sachs' own life, part of the PBS American Masters series, to debut on WFSU-TV on April 9th at 10 o'clock Eastern. And there's going to be 2 repeat broadcasts of the program as well. More on that to come. This evening, our focus, though, is going to be on this particular work that Sally already held up and showed to us here. This is Oliver Sachs' An Anthropologist on Mars, 7 Paradoxical Tales, first published back in 1996. That was nearly 20 years before Sachs's death. And there are 7 case studies in the book, which we're going to be touching on throughout the hour. And I say we because we do have that outstanding panel that we want you to meet. And let's do that right now. Michael Bakken, of course, Dr. Michael Bakken, professor of ethnomusicology at Florida State University College of Music. He, the head of the World Music Ensembles program at FSU, the Balinese Gamelan Gong Ensemble, so many things. Also an author in his own right, too. More than 70 publications to his credit, including the book Music and Autism, Speaking for Ourselves. Michael, it is a delight to see you. It has been too long, buddy. How you doing?
I am doing great, Tom, and so glad to be here and to see you again. Never often enough. So thank you. Thanks for having me be a part of this.
I can't wait to plumb the depths of your knowledge and expertise on this here. We're also joined by Dr. Amy Weatherby, Distinguished Research Professor of Clinical Sciences at Florida State University's College of Medicine, Director of the Autism Institute in the College of Medicine, a Fellow of the American Speech Language Hearing Association, over 35 years of clinical experience, also Executive Director of the FSU Center for Autism and Related Disabilities. The plaudits go on and on, Dr. Amy. Thank you for joining this conversation tonight, too. Well, let's start here for a second. Before we get into, especially the audience questions, since we are talking about this particular Oliver Sachs book, its relevance and as a departure point for what we have learned since, perhaps, Michael Bakken, let's start with you. Just your overall impression of the 7 tales contained within this volume. Folks like Mr. I and Greg F. and Dr. Carl Bennett and Virgil, all these people who perceive things and think through things perhaps in a different way than do we. What do you think of Oliver's work here and these 7 tales?
Well, Oliver Sachs is an icon for all of us who work in areas of neurocognitive difference. He really set the stage for so much work that followed, both in terms of the substance of it and also in terms of the style, the humanization of people who tend to be dehumanized in certain kinds of clinical or research contexts, as well as in the popular literature. I might quote from a wonderful book to which actually Oliver Sachs wrote the foreword, which is a book called Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity by Steve Silberman. And he talks about, in particular relative to autism, after 50 years of case reports describing autistic people in terms befitting robots or imbeciles, Sachs presented Temple Grandin, who of course is the subject of the Anthropologist on Mars chapter at the end there, in the full breadth of her humanity, capable of joy, whimsy, tenderness, passion about her work, exuberance, longing, philosophical musing on her legacy, and sly subterfuge. He acknowledged the prevailing theory that autism is foremost a disorder of affect, of empathy, but also explored her deep sense of kinship with other disabled people and with animals whose fates she saw as intertwined in a society that views both as less than human, in a society that views both less than human. So, you know, I think perhaps the single greatest contribution of Oliver Sachs was to really go in deep, to really get to know people, get to understand the way their minds worked, what made them tick, how their creativity, how their affect, how their emotions connected to worlds in which those aspects of their beings often were not well understood. And so on that level, I think, you know, he's absolutely critical to the intellectual and humanistic history of all of us. I do also have some critical perspectives on Dr. Sachs's work, but maybe we can come back to some of those later. I think for me, his greatest influence on my own work, you know, especially the book that you mentioned, the Music and Autism Speaking for Ourselves book, was it sort of paved the way to say, yes, we can engage in deep relationships through musical performance, through conversation, through just hanging out with people who are neurocognitively different, and rather than describe them and depict them and represent them in terms of their, you know, symptomatology or you know, their deficits or things like that, we can rather say, these are the people who are the world's leading experts at being who they are, and we want to understand them on those terms. And I think Sachs really paved the way for that kind of perspective.
Some great insights there. Dr. Amy, your opinion of the book and Sachs' overall approach to autism and some other neurological, we don't even want to perhaps call it dysfunction, but differences maybe.
There's differing opinions on that. Yeah, so Oliver Sacks to me was, as Michael said, an icon, but he influenced my perspective on neurology. So I'm a bit older than Michael, and so I was in undergraduate and graduate school as his books were coming out, and so they fascinated me. I think just from his storytelling, you know, it's not as technical as what Michael's saying, but just his storytelling, his ability to observe different characteristics and describe them from the perspective of the brain. And so I think at that time, early on, as we were beginning to understand the effects of stroke, the effects of head injury, understanding the unique combinations of features that individuals, some will have a stroke and lose their language, others will lose their musical abilities, others will, you know, understand, well, how does that work? And what does the left hemisphere do? And what does the right hemisphere do? So it's sort of in that time when we were thinking more about the division, now we're thinking more about the integration of the hemispheres. You know, we've learned so much, but from the time when he was writing these, they were magnificent stories based on real people and just being a great observer. So he inspired me in that way, and specifically his stories about autism were, you know, and I started reading him way before he wrote this book, were quite fascinating. So of course the case in The Anthropologist on Mars, the combination of descriptions of Stephen Wiltshire's incredible memory and artistic or architectural design skills, and then Temple Grandin, and his description of them and meeting them. I've had the honor of actually meeting Temple Grandin and being on some panels where we were different, you know, invited speakers and getting to sit next to her at a meal. And it's so fascinating to watch her over the years, how she has developed to become a better and better speaker and describer of herself and autism. But so she's this great success story. So I just think his capturing their unique combination of skills, and these are unique, not common even among people with autism, but they capture the potential of the brain and of what people with autism and hopefully others can, you know, have the capacity to learn. So it's inspiring.
One word that you just used, Amy, that I want to key off of, and Michael, if you can jump in here too, capacity or flexibility. If one facet of the brain is somehow messed up, there are other parts of the brain that will kick in to compensate, to do other things, and perhaps develop even new aspects of personality, creativity, these sorts of things that originally the person may not have even been able to tap into. Is that a fairly common thing that you have seen, Michael?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's common for people in general. Whatever your experience is, whatever your kind of toolkit is, I mean, right now I'm dealing with a situation with this PVD, you know, eye floaters and flashes and things like that. And so I'm having to retrain myself to look at the computer and, you know, where do I cast my gaze and things like that. And so, you know, over time, I will adapt to that. I'll develop, you know, aspects of my cognitive potential that I never, you know, had to, because I had the luxury of not having to. And I think we see similar kinds of, you know, capacity maximization, adaptation in conditions, you know, say like autism or ADHD or you know, impairments of any kind or differences of any kind, however we want to define these terms. I think some of it is just a question of a hardwired neurological configuration where, you know, people come out of the box a certain way. For example, in the area of music, one of my co-authors of the Music and Autism book, a guy named Graham Gibson, who's actually incidentally the son of the famous science fiction author William Gibson. You know, from a very young age, I mean, from when he was like 2 years old, someone could play 10 random notes on a piano that are not even consonant with one another, and he would be able to identify every one of those pitches. There's no teaching that. There's no way, you know, I can't do that, and I've been, you know, dealing with music my whole life. So it just comes to that individual that way. And it seems miraculous and bizarre from the outside, which is what leads to these savant designations, which can be problematic unto themselves. But to Graham, it probably seems equally miraculous and bizarre that the three of us, without having prepared in any particular way for this conversation, can sit down and have this conversation. We don't really think all that much of that because we were born with a particular kind of, you know, set of tools that enabled us to move fairly organically into that role. So, you know, and this extends to all kinds of dimensions. I've had the, you know, the great joy of getting to work with some of the world's great musicians in different cultures. And so that includes, for example, studio musicians in Los Angeles, and it includes great gamelan musicians in Bali. Now, as far as their level of achievement, their level of capacity, I would say they're about on par. But what these Balinese musicians can do, where, you know, at the drop of a hat, they have 300 lengthy, complicated musical compositions that they can sit down at a gamelan and play and teach any one of the parts of the 30 different parts, you know, it seems impossible. Similarly, the LA studio musicians, you know, you could take a can of paint and splat it against a piece of paper, and it, you know, if it had 5-line staff notation, they would read it note perfectly. Where does that come from? Now, granted, a lot of it is developed, but some of it is also just there to start. But the interesting thing is that probably if the Balinese musicians had grown up in Los Angeles, they'd be able to sight read like crazy. And if those Los Angeles studio musicians had grown up in Bali, they'd have 300 gamelan compositions. So this is where it becomes complicated. There's a kind of a, you know, a common set of capacities that can be developed differently depending on cultural context. And then there's a neurological configuration, which allows for certain possibilities that are not possible for other people. So Graham will never have the social facility that, say, we do. We will never have the pitch identification abilities that he does. And to me, what's been interesting in kind of moving at the intersection of, you know, music, neurology, ethnography, is trying to kind of split that difference, trying to find out what is actually capacity that isn't being realized, as opposed to what is simply neurological difference that, you know, there is no point in the middle, but it doesn't mean that we can't complement each other and benefit from each other's strengths and gifts and opportunities for engagement on different terms than we might have originally conceived.
Is that your thinking too, Dr. Amy, that it's not a zero-sum game, that we have compensatory possibilities perhaps that are untapped? If one set of neurons is closed off, that's fine. Here are some others over here that might take their place and do other things with that information.
Yeah, I think what I'm drawn to in the work that we do is thinking about neuroplasticity and the interaction with how the environment, the learning environment, can impact. So our work has focused on very early detection of autism. And so as you go younger and younger, there is, as you go down to birth, the signs of autism shortly after birth are not real clear, and even by 6 months, but somewhere between 6 months and 24 months, they become clear. So there's this unfolding, emerging. Well, if you can get in earlier, before they fully unfolded, can you prevent some of the impairments, but yet you want to promote the strengths? So that's what we're really interested in doing. And it's fascinating because if you go too early, nobody sees the symptoms. So they don't really think we need to do anything. So part of our work is helping families understand these subtle early signs, which are going to develop into bigger signs over time. You know, autism, the core symptoms are this impairment in social interaction and social communication. And so having those impairment in social attention may be part of the basis for the unleashing of these incredible strengths. As Temple Grandin describes herself, thinking in pictures she can memorize, and obviously Stephen Wilshire he sees something once and he can recreate it. So these incredible visual memory skills, maybe the social impairments unleash those. But so can we preserve the strengths, but also build these weaknesses and still have autism, but autism with strengths? And so that's the challenge of kind of doing both, finding it early, taking advantage of the strengths, but also building these weaknesses. Then the other part of autism is what's described as repetitive behaviors and restricted interests. And it may be those restricted interests, these narrow interests they have intense interest in, that leads to these, we can call them splinter skills or savant skills or unusually amazing talents. So it's a fascinating disorder, but it also is important to recognize that it can be a very severe disorder that can have very impairing features and require a great deal of cost for education and then care in adulthood. So we have the range of, you know, the incredible talents, but then also the severe autism, and it's this huge spectrum. And so we're understanding that now. I think in the time of the writing of this book and before that, you know, I mean, originally it was assumed that the mother caused autism. Wrong, completely wrong, but coming out of the 50s and even into the 60s. So it was in the 1960s that we were starting to have the potential biological basis of autism. So I do think part of the value of Oliver Sachs' work is that he spoke to the biology, the neurological basis, so that now it's widely accepted and that it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. But starting so early in life, there's incredible potential and capacity that's quite exciting when we see these children so early and watch them grow up.
Well, you mentioned spectrum, and that, of course, is the modern understanding of autism, that it is not an either-or situation. These people are normal, and here are people with autism, right. That it is a broad spectrum from right. Someone who is so incredibly functional, such as Temple Grandin, right. Who forms the last chapter of Oliver Sachs' book here and has this phenomenal self-awareness that seems she has almost willed herself to have it. I'm thinking, how does one go about doing that when this lack of self-awareness seems to be endemic to the classical understanding of autism?
Yeah, and perhaps it's a myth. Perhaps that's not, you know, and I think Temple has taught us that. You know, perhaps it's a myth that people with autism don't have an understanding of themselves. They're not good, and often it's very stressful for them to interact with people. So that can be difficult and it can be stressful, but that doesn't mean they're not aware of their strengths and who they are and what their issues are. So I think there's a lot that we have to learn to understand, and assumptions were made when these books were written, and we have assumptions still, but we have a broader understanding. Many people that we work with, children with autism, and as they grow up, have a lot of awareness about their social difficulties. So it really can be quite different. I think Temple has also learned more and more about herself as a young adult from college into now her later adulthood. So she's shown amazing growth in her ability to introspect and speak and explain it.
Michael Bakken, are we all on the spectrum somehow? Looking at these stories in the Sachs book, you know, I see little maybe Tourettic tics that I may have, or little savant-like, I certainly don't have the abilities that so many of these folks have, like the artistry of Stephen or some of these other folks who were in the book. But is there any real definition of even normal? Should we throw that term out the window completely because we all are on this long continuum somewhere?
It's a deep question. Let me give an example from an interaction that I had with my brother a number of years ago. So my brother's wife, Marley Klein, his first wife, died tragically of leukemia when she was about 41 years old. And so my brother Joel, you know, went through that whole experience of seeing his high school sweetheart, who became his wife, you know, die this very, very painful, awful death. So a few years after that, I was dealing with some challenging chronic pain issues, and it was, you know, it was quite debilitating. It was to the point where I was thinking I might have to take disability leave for a semester from FSU. And so anyway, I called my brother and was telling him about this, and I was starting to have some success. I had been going to an acupuncturist here in town, and she was working on my liver meridian, you know, and saying that the pains that I was having in my hands and arms, which of course as a drummer are a bit problematic, you know, were coming from the liver not functioning the way it is supposed to be energetically, and so on and so forth. So I was quite enthusiastic about this progress, and I was sharing that with my brother, and he just cut me off and he says, "Wait, did you say you're having liver dysfunction?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I mean, it's a kind of a Chinese medicine thing. It's, you know, in energy imbalance." And he just cut me off and says, "I don't want to hear about it." And I was like really blown away. You know, this is my brother. I mean, you know, he should have a bit more patience and compassion than that. I'm going through a hard time. And I said, well, wait, I don't understand. He says, "Have you been to a real doctor, you know, a Western doctor?" And I say, "Well, you know, I've had my annual physical. Do you have liver disease?" "No." Well, then, you know, then I really don't want to hear about this, because I've seen liver disease. I saw my wife die as her liver collapsed. And what you're talking about is not that. And it just, you know, it just hit him at a level where it's like, that's not the same thing. You know, you go to your acupuncture, you do what you got to do, but we're not on the same level. And I think what we're talking about here with Are We All on the Spectrum, I think it raises a similar kind of issue. The points that Amy is raising about people who are very severely affected, in some ways, it does those people a disservice if we say, you know, because, you know, occasionally I feel awkward at a party, that I'm a little bit on the autism spectrum. So I think there are these different levels at which we can say there is something that an autism spectrum represents. And then there's a continuum of different kinds of social engagement and reciprocity skills that you know, we're all a part of. But the difference between autism, you know, autism spectrum conditions or social communication disorders, as they're now called, that's a whole other thing. I'll leave that to Amy if she wants to go there. And these sort of, you know, relatively neurotypical slipping and sliding along some kind of a continuum. I think we need to be mindful of those distinctions, and we need to make sure that the people who most need the kind of services and accommodations that true, you know, autistic challenge presents, get those without the, you know, without the waters being diluted by a lot of other mixing and matching. You know, and this has become complicated since the DSM-5 was published in 2013, where Asperger's syndrome or Asperger's disorder was taken out of the DSM. So suddenly all these people who were within, eligible for services through that within the autism spectrum suddenly weren't. I actually gave a Zoom talk at the University of South Carolina today and was talking to a music teacher who had really been caught in the midst of all that because she had all these students who were getting these services. Suddenly they couldn't get the services anymore. So, there's political, legislative, policy related kinds of issues around all of this. So on the one hand, yes, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we are all on a continuum and that there is the capacity, no matter what the level of whatever we want to call it, function or difference, that we can all find ways to connect with one another, whether that's through music, through talking, through art. I think we want to always recognize our fellow humans as such. But at the same time, I think it's important to be clear that, a little bit of social awkwardness is a very different thing from autism full-fledged.
Yeah, so I'd like to comment on that. Yeah, so I was on the DSM-5 work group that actually removed Asperger from the subcategories. What we did is we actually got rid of all the subcategories.
Yeah.
And the reason is that the research clearly indicates that we do not yet have a diagnostic tool that would differentiate autism from Asperger. So we actually then promoted the term and used the term autism spectrum disorder. And I think before that, often the term Asperger was used to refer to higher functioning individuals with autism who were more capable, and therefore it was a preferred diagnosis because the prognosis would be better associated because of the skills. So, but the research doesn't support that we can differentiate yet. Now, there may actually be autism versus Asperger, maybe it exists, but we don't have the biological measures to distinguish it, and we don't have the behavioral diagnostic tools to distinguish it. And I understand it got the most, when they put it out for public reply, the record-winning response from emails to the APA, American Psychiatric Association. So it was a very long, drawn-out committee process to review the comments and make the final decisions, but it reflects the research. The other point that I wanted to make is that, so you kind of said, well, if you had Asperger's before and now you don't qualify for services. So I'm going to argue with that, against that, Michael, because I think really if you call it autism spectrum disorder, they should qualify for services. So you're talking about two different labels with similar behaviors. So it should not have prevented services. Actually, it should have increased access to services because there are many agencies and the federal law that mandates free education, the IDEA, individual education for all, actually specifies autism, but doesn't specify Asperger. So it's more often that you will not get services if you have an Asperger diagnosis. So we were actually trying to help get access to more accurately describe this is really autism. And part of the complication is stigma. So that the term Asperger held up for many years because of the stigma of autism, more stigma than Asperger. So we recently had a speaker, a colleague of mine, Dr. and good friend, Dr. Richard Grinker, who's an anthropologist.
Friend of mine too.
And a friend, who lives in Washington, D.C. And he has a new book on stigma. And so the whole issue of stigma is a fascinating part of this whole dilemma. The DSM-5, that book is a guideline of diagnostic criteria, and there's a cutoff. It's kind of like we kind of had all these metaphors, like trying to put a joint in a meatloaf. You're going to draw a line somewhere of what's a disorder and what's this sort of typical neurodiversity. And the difference is whether it's an impairment. So if you have traits and you have strengths, that's great. But if it becomes impairing to your everyday life, your ability to learn, your ability to get a job, your ability to succeed in social relationships, your ability to be happy, and in life, then it could be an impairment, and then it falls into, whatever you want to call it, disorder, disability, or illness. And it's the stigma might influence which you prefer, but there's this line where you're saying it's an impairment. And on the other side, And that's like 2% of the population that has autism spectrum disorder. The rest may have traits that are really good traits to have.
We have a question from the audience here, folks. People would like to know what chapter of the 7 you liked or resonated with you the most. Michael, did you have a favorite?
Yeah, my favorite is the title chapter, An Anthropologist on Mars, and probably my least favorite is the one that precedes it, Prodigies.
How come?
Well, I feel, let me sort of segue from something that Amy just said there. I think this is an interesting example of the committees that sort of deliberated very carefully and at great length and with great intelligence and collaboration on the DSM-5 and came to those determinations. We're setting that up to make it a more humane, more inclusive, better targeted for serving the people who need what they need kind of mechanism, you know, for diagnostic and for services. But then once something gets out there in the world, what people do with it, we can't control, we can't predict, so that people who are used to a certain way of classifying themselves, of identifying themselves, of sort of seeking services on the basis of a certain, and suddenly it's like, wait, we don't exist anymore, wait, we don't have, and so you get all of this transitional confusion. And I think that's, in some ways, what I see as a distinction between these two chapters, the one that I like and the one that I don't like so well, where I feel in, and I think, you know, it also ties into the level of difference or challenge that Stephen Wiltshire versus Temple Grandin contend with. So in the case of Temple Grandin, because she was so capable of speaking on her own behalf, of explaining her own ontology, her own sort of theory of being, and even of being able to sort of relate that to how a, you know, so-called neurotypical person would experience her and would experience that kind of difference. I feel like Sachs was able to completely embrace that and sort of go in deep and allow her to come out strong in terms of how she was self-representing. The sort of the theoretical hinge on which my new book is based is a kind of a move from representation to representation, where rather than, you know, myself as the musicologist or, you know, whoever is the neurologist, Sachs, you know, speaking about these people, it's more, we're sort of the producers behind the scene who create opportunities for these people to speak for themselves on their own terms. And Temple Grandin is certainly capable, eminently capable of doing that. Stephen Wiltshire is not capable of doing that in the same way. And it felt to me like at this stage, I mean, to me, the eighth paradoxical tale is Oliver Sacks himself. On the one hand, being this incredibly visionary thinker, who's way ahead of the curve, who's really, you know, getting the humanity of people who are not being recognized for their humanity by many others. And yet he also kind of knee-jerk retreats back to this pathological paradigm without sort of critically engaging it much. I'll give you one example. There's a part, I think it's page 216, and he says, Stephen greeted me with a booming, "Hello, Oliver," shouted with great friendliness and warmth, or so I thought. But then I was not sure. Was it merely a social automatism? And so, you know, we see him sort of struggling. Is this the, you know, is this the emergence of this person, or is it really just, you know, smoke and mirrors? And then the part that, you know, really kind of rankled me is he says, he comes out on the side of, well, it is more of a social automatism, because the great neurologist Kurt Goldstein, with all due respect to Kurt Goldstein, who you know, whose claim about another autistic boy, who Goldstein said, you know, his emotional responses and human attachments remain shallow and perfunctory. And this seems enough rationale to write off the very possibility of Stephen's sincerity and genuine warmth. And to me, that was a real missed opportunity, because to me, I mean, I've been playing music and hanging out with autistic people for 20 years, and, you know, across different realms of the spectrum. And there's a tremendous amount of sincerity and a tremendous amount of warmth and a tremendous amount of emotional expression and empathy and all the things that, you know, at some level, as far as he goes, Sachs seems to be holding back. Now, again, it's 25 years ago. There are all kinds of caveats. But to me, the difference between prodigies and that kind of tendency toward regression, toward automatizing and dehumanizing autistic people, as opposed to An Anthropologist on Mars, where we really do get that full sense of the humanity of Temple Grandin. I think that's a fundamental distinction. And, I guess also to Sachs's credit, that his own thinking was evolving in quantum leaps as he moved from one project to the next.
Okay, Amy, what was your favorite, and did you have a least favorite out of those segments?
Well, I liked a lot of them, but the ones I'm drawn to are the ones that have to do with specific neurological impairments, like the amnesia. I'm very interested in memory and amnesia, Tourette's syndrome, and the story too about the being born blind and then being unblinded is fascinating. So the brain's response. But I need to comment on what Michael said. So thinking about Temple Grandin, the thing I think that's so important to highlight about her is that he wrote about her in the mid-90s. She had evolved already at that point. She had an incredible teacher and set of teachers in her life from early childhood that made a huge difference on her skills and knowledge and capacity to learn. But by the time she entered college to becoming a spokesperson for autism, which was a bit later, she changed a great deal and continued. So I've been in the field twice as long as you, I think. I've been in it for almost 40 years. So she changed a lot. So by 95, she's already developed many capacities that, in terms of social interaction and self-reflection, that she wasn't able to capture and communicate earlier. So just kind of keeping that in mind. So we don't know where Stephen Wilshire, he's a bit younger, where he's going to end up as he gets older. It'll be interesting to see.
Right. Point well taken. I guess my point, though, had more to do with Sachs than with either of the individuals who were his interlocutors in those two cases. So to me, when he says things like, how the Russia trip was saddening, disappointing, disillusioning, he had hoped to get behind Stephen's autism, to see the person underneath the mind, but there had been only the merest intimation of this. I had hoped perhaps sentimentally for some depth of feeling. I had the sense of a radically different, almost alien mode of mind, and so on and so forth. As I'm reading that, I'm kind of going into the eighth paradoxical tale, where I'm wanting to see Sachs make that same kind of leap to a kind of an empathy and communion with Stephen. So to me, it's sort of this funny house of mirrors of these things going on. And again,
it's amazing. Things are coming in really fast here.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, but Michael, you're bringing your current knowledge. And so when Sachs was writing this, especially his books in the 80s, autism was 1 in 2,000. And 75% had intellectual disability, or what was called mental retardation. Now it's 1 in 54, probably more than that.
Yep.
And it's 40% or less have an intellectual disability. So the landscape has changed dramatically in what he was looking at as autism, and the field and our understanding, again, coming out of misperceptions about etiology before that. So I think he contributed to what we know, at least through the 90s.
Briefly, folks, if we could talk a second about the one connection here among so many of these stories is the impact of music, and it isn't just on Dr. Carl Bennett, who has Tourette's, and when he gets into a musical groove, if you will, the tics vanish. The sense of rhythm seems to propel people into a more positive, a less dysfunctional direction. Amy, your experience replicate that if you have that kind of a grounding of something that has a sense of rhythm or repeatability, or that can be really helpful in a lot of cases?
Absolutely, as well as the visual. But if we think about the rhythm or music, so I'm a speech pathologist, worked in the VA hospital for quite a while, and worked with patients, stroke, head injury. And so patients who weren't able to talk, we were kind of testing music therapy in the sense of using the rhythm and melody to get them to be able to say words. And it's continued now to using melodic intonation therapy is what it's been called. And so that melody and rhythm can aid, it can help autism, it can help stutterers is another group, you know, as well as you mentioned Tourette's and other motor disorders. So that melody and rhythm is a big thing. What we do in our work in approaching intervention and supports for families and teachers to help students with autism is think about a whole set of supports. So music, melody, rhythm, predictability. So, you know, and then sensory information can help. They may have visual strengths. So instead of just telling them things, being able to show them with the visual supports to help their understanding of what they're supposed to do. So there's all sorts of different supports. And I think music is one of many that are really important for, and then there can be musical strengths or visual strengths as in artwork and so on. And people,
yeah, and your experience there is very, very much in music, Michael. So you've seen that kind of connection too, not just as therapy per se, but there is something perhaps more profound going on there.
Well, I could approach that from two different directions. The question, it's a really interesting question, and I agree with everything that Amy was just saying there. First off, so the first direction, I've seen some very physical, tangible, visceral kinds of experiences, like this one boy that we worked with, who's the basis of an article I wrote called Following Frank, where he would get very emotionally dysregulated. We were working actually with the SERTS model that Amy and her colleagues developed, and he would become very emotionally dysregulated. And as we were analyzing these videos, we started to see that when he would start to act out, when he would start to get destructive, knock down instruments and things like that, at the time, we were just sort of dealing with damage control. But later, when I went back and watched the videos, there was a consistent pattern where every time he would get like that, at least when he managed to get himself to calm down, he would go and wrap himself around this Australian didgeridoo that my colleague Ben Goen was playing. It has this very low resonant tone. Amy, you know that instrument well, I know. Or he would go over to the gongs of the gamelan, the giant gong. So it was something about these low frequencies that would just enable him to kind of get his body together, and then that would get his mind together. And it was quite extraordinary and consistent. So that takes me to part two, which was, I was very excited about this, that I wanted to write about this and was trying to develop a theory of low frequencies relative to emotional regulation, trying to tie it into the SERTS model and all these kinds of things. And then I went home and all excited, and Megan, my wife, who was a cognitive psychologist, who Amy knows as well, she was cooking in the kitchen, and I said, oh, I've got this new thing happen, and Frank, and blah, and I was blah, 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 blah. And then she just cut me off, and she said, you just don't get it, do you, Mike? And I said, what? Here I was thinking I was brilliant. Your one's wife will often correct you in those moments. And so she said, you're always talking about the music and the sound, the rhythm, and this, that. But what's really going on when you have those sessions in that EWAMP, that exploratory world music playground, is these kids are coming into this room with their parents, with these musicians, and we're closing the door, and suddenly the judgments go away, and people are accepted on their own terms, and there's no set standard of how the music is supposed to sound. The music is emergent in this improvisatory moment for the children themselves to create, for them to have the agency to define their own experience. And we found that using the SERTS model, the primary measure that came out strong was expression of success and confidence. And so her claim, Megan's claim, which I agree with, is that yes, music has some special auditory, physical kinds of capacities, but maybe it's more that social experience of what a free and open and inclusive and agency inspiring kind of way of being musical with other people. Maybe that's as or more important to how people can self-actualize when they're constantly in situations where they're coming up short, where they're being judged, where they're being ridiculed or ignored, and now here they get to be themselves. I think the social dimension might be at least as important as the sonic dimension of music per se.
Folks, the hour has just raced right by. Here's a two-parter to kind of lead us towards denouement on this whole thing, if we could. Given what we have been talking about tonight, it seems apparent that perhaps Oliver Sacks may not have aged super well in light of new findings, research, explorations that have been done subsequent to the publishing of his books. But by the same token, is there anyone now contemporaneously writing that brings the the stories of these people to the awareness of the general public as well as he did? Kind of a two-parter there. Amy, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, because I read his work early on as he was writing it, I was reading the New Yorker articles where they first came out and then turned into books. And, you know, I think at the time it was really important, not just, I mean, autism was a slice of what he was writing about, but all of these, you know, understanding many different types of neurological impairments and how humans face it and how it impacts them and how it leads to really interesting combinations of skills after that. But I do think he contributed to, so I don't know how to answer the question of who's current that is going to be the writer that's going to last for a while in history that's writing now. I don't think we can look at Oliver Sacks and think of him as, you know, not relevant because a lot of the information is no longer accurate. That's not really fair in the sense of he's writing these at the time. We need to consider the history and the context. I think at the time they were helping to move the field, and the field was really bleak for autism in the 50s. I mean, the 40s, it was interesting. It was first introduced by Connor and Asperger, but then, you know, the 50s and the 60s were bleak. And so in terms of no options for treatment, often institutionalized, medicated, tied to their beds, not good options. And again, this is the 1 in 2000 or 1 in, might have been less than. So I think he came about at a time where we were moving out of that. And I think he contributed greatly to a way of looking at many of these neurological impairments. But I think autism now, there's so many authors now. It's a huge field from many perspectives. It was kind of owned by neurology and psychiatry. And now I think we have many fields and disciplines that are involved, from music to speech language pathology and on, of course, to other psychology and others. So I think now it's that interdisciplinary perspective as we work together to try to figure out how do we best help children with autism, adults with autism, families that have children with autism. And I just want to close my comment by saying we approach it from productive roles. So it's kind of a little different direction from where we start because we're going younger. Can we help a child learn to take on a productive role, do something with their body, with their hands, with their attention? And then everything grows out of that. We expand from there and build the social interaction skills from that. And then we can build language skills and communication and can learn many different capacities, as well as have their interests drive what are those activities early on. So I think that we can start with and have high expectations. So you're kind of describing come in the room and let go of some of the stigma and other. We kind of come at it from let's expect a lot, because you're going to not get a lot if you don't expect a lot. So expecting a lot from the children who really have a lot of capacity to learn, but they need to be well regulated. If they're distressed and upset, they're not going to be available for learning.
Thank you. Michael Bakken, you get the last word on this one.
Well, to me, you know, I agree with everything that Amy just said about Sachs and his legacy and his importance. If you're asking, you know, who are the writers who are carrying this on, to me, they are autistic authors. For example, the contributors to this amazing anthology, Loud Hands, Autistic People Speaking, people like Dr. Elizabeth J. Grace, Amy Sequenzi, and Nick Walker, they are telling their own stories in beautiful writing, in profound, enlightening ways, and we need to listen to them. And you know, those are the people who I enlisted as my co-authors of Music and Autism. That way, I don't have to take the mantle that Oliver Sacks. I don't have to take that responsibility. I just create the forum and let autistic people speak for themselves. Of course, a lot of autistic people cannot speak. That's maybe episode 2 of our journey here. But at least within this domain, those are the people that I'm most excited to read, is people who are autistic, who are speaking their own truths. And I think that we really need to all listen to.
You've given us something new to read, Michael. Thank you so much. Folks, before we close it off, Jeremy, you have a video that you wanted to share with everyone. Why don't we take a look at that, and then we'll return and bid everyone a fond good evening.
Meet Oliver Sachs, the doctor, the writer, and the man.
Much of my life has been spent trying to imagine what it's like to be another human being.
His great gift was storytelling about the human condition in a medical context.
He would tell these stories so well that people who are left out are storied back into the world.
For his story, look for the acclaimed Rick Burns film, Oliver Sachs, His Own Life.
And we're beginning to get somewhere.
On American Masters.
And again, that will be on WFSU TV on the 9th of April at 10 o'clock Eastern, and 2 repeat performances in the following days on that. Folks, it has been a delightful conversation. Michael Bakken and Amy Weatherby, thank you for being a part of a fascinating evening, and the story will continue. I can't wait to see exactly where this goes next, and I hope that you will bring us along for the ride as the research continues and our knowledge increases in this incredible area. Folks, thank you very much for being a part of our virtual book club this evening, focusing on Oliver Sachs and His Own Life, which will be coming up on TV, and to the homework assignment that we all had, the Oliver Sachs book, which had 7 fantastic case studies in it of folks who are on various kinds of spectrum. To the people of Midtown Reader, Sally and Jeremy and the whole staff there, thank you for being part of it. And to my boss, Kim Kelling, thank you for officiating on this presentation here in affiliation with WFSU Public Media. I'm Tom Flanigan. Thank you, folks, for joining us, and have a good evening.